The courtroom was still, a silence so heavy it felt as though the air itself refused to move. All eyes turned toward the elevated bench where Judge Amy Coney Barrett leaned forward, her voice sharpened like the edge of a blade. With a tone both cool and cutting, she spoke not with inquiry, but with condemnation, her words landing like a gavel meant to silence. "Congresswoman Crockett," she declared, "your arguments lack substance. They reek of performance, not principle. Perhaps the courtroom is not the place for theatrics." A collective gasp rippled across the chamber. Reporters' pens froze mid-stroke. Even seasoned staffers shifted uneasily, unsure if they had just witnessed a legitimate rebuke or something more sinister, an attack not on the words, but on the woman who spoke them. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the balance of power had shifted, and Barrett had set the tone. Cool, dismissive, unchallenged. Jasmine Crockett sat motionless at her table, her expression unreadable. To some, it looked as if the judge's words had cut deep, stripping away her confidence. A few smirks spread among Barrett's supporters, convinced the Congresswoman had been put in her place. But those who knew Crockett best recognized the silence for what it was. Not surrender, but calculation. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the flicker in Crockett's eyes, the measured breath she drew as the sting of Barrett's insult settled over the room. It was the look of someone weighing every second, resisting the impulse to strike back too soon, building instead towards something far greater. The tension was unbearable. Even the hum of the overhead lights seemed louder than usual. Barrett's gaze lingered on Crockett, satisfied, certain that her words had left an indelible mark. To the casual observer, it looked like dominance. But beneath the surface, a storm was gathering, an energy no one in the sides at chamber was prepared to confront. What the judge believed to be a dismissal would soon reveal itself as the spark that ignited a dramatic reversal. Crockett's silence was not the absence of power, it was the prelude to it. But no one expected that within minutes the entire courtroom would witness a reversal so powerful it left the nation talking for weeks. Outside the courthouse, the world was already divided. Cable news anchors framed the proceedings as a battle for the soul of American justice. To some, it was just another hearing, another performance in a long string of partisan clashes. But to others, millions watching from living rooms, from lunch breaks, from classrooms where teachers dared to stream history as it happened, this moment carried a weight that reached far beyond the paneled walls of a courtroom. Because this wasn't just about one exchange between a Supreme Court justice and a Congresswoman, this was about who gets to speak and who gets to be silenced, about whether dignity belongs only to the powerful or if it can be claimed by those who dare to challenge them. Amy Coney Barrett, in the eyes of her supporters, embodied authority, a figure cloaked in judicial power, wielding language like a scalpel. Yet to critics, her remarks reflected something deeper. A pattern of dismissal, the quiet assumption that certain voices, particularly those of women of color, could be brushed aside under the guise of decorum. And across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, a rising figure whose very presence challenged centuries of exclusion. Crockett's sharpness, her unapologetic embrace of identity, her refusal to bow, these qualities drew admiration from those who had long felt unseen in America's halls of power. For them, this clash was not simply an argument. It was representation colliding with tradition, fire meeting stone. The stakes stretched further than reputation. They touched the raw nerves of political polarization tearing at the country's seams. On one side, a movement desperate to preserve the old order, where authority spoke down and others listened. On the other, a generation rising to insist that voices long silenced could not only speak but reshape the narrative itself. In immigrant households, parents told their children to watch closely. This is what it means, they said, to stand tall when they try to shrink you. In university dorms, students streamed the trial and whispered that Crockett's composure felt like their own unspoken resistance given voice. Even in church basements and barbershops, the confrontation was dissected not as law, but as symbol. An echo of battles fought on marches, in protests, in every corner where dignity demanded recognition. The atmosphere in the chamber mirrored the nation itself, charged, brittle, ready to shatter with one more push. Reporters sensed it, their tweets tinged with anticipation. Is this just another clash, or will something bigger break through? What Barrett likely thought of as a momentary reprimand carried the weight of generations. Because when you tell someone their words reek of performance, you're not just questioning their argument. You're questioning their right to stand at all. That subtext, clear to anyone who had ever been underestimated or dismissed, was what electrified the air. And Crockett, sitting in silence, embodied that tension perfectly. She was not simply a politician defending herself. She was a mirror, reflecting millions who had been told their voices didn't belong. Her stillness was their stillness. Her breath was their breath. Her impending answer would not be hers alone. It would be a collective reckoning. The nation waited. The chamber trembled with expectation. And just when the nation thought to this was another routine attack, the tension would escalate into a turning point no one saw coming. To understand the sting of Judge Amy Coney Barrett's words, one must understand the force behind them. She did not rise to her position by chance or by charm, but by cultivating an image of unflinching authority. From the moment she first stepped into the national spotlight during her nomination hearings, Barrett projected the aura of a woman who believed she was above reproach. Her demeanor, controlled, precise, relentlessly polished, was her armor, and her intellect, sharp and technical, was the weapon she wielded without hesitation. To her supporters, this aura made her formidable. They praised her as disciplined, a jurist of steel nerves who could withstand pressure without cracking. They celebrated her composure, mistaking her distance for dignity, her detachment for wisdom. But to her critics, that same detachment revealed something colder, a refusal to acknowledge the human weight behind the laws she interpreted. When confronted with questions of identity, of lived experience, of ordinary people's struggles, Barrett seemed to look through them, as if they were footnotes in a casebook rather than flesh and blood lives. Her rulings, and even more so her rhetoric, carried the same undertone: efficiency over empathy, doctrine over dignity. It was never the outright shout of hostility, but the quiet implication that she already knew better, that no counter-argument could ever truly disturb the fortress of her certainty. Her authority was her crown, and with every word she spoke from the bench, she wore it heavily, reminding others of the weight she carried. Inside the courtroom, this translated into a particular brand of power. She rarely raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her clipped phrases, her penetrating questions, her sharp dismissals, these were enough to disarray those unprepared to face her. Lawyers often walked away rattled, replaying exchanges in their heads, wondering why their strongest points had been brushed aside as if they were trivial. Barrett's brilliance was undeniable, but brilliance untethered from humility has a way of curdling into arrogance. And arrogance was Barrett's shadow. When she spoke to Jasmine Crockett with the words, "Perhaps the courtroom is not the place for theatrics," she was not simply offering critique. She was reinforcing a pattern that had followed her entire career. The instinct to belittle rather than to engage, to remind others that she sat elevated while they sat below. The moment was not an accident. It was a culmination. What makes such figures so intimidating is not merely their intelligence, but their certainty that they cannot be touched. Barrett had spent years cloaked in that certainty, reinforced by those who adored her for embodying their vision of order. She represented stability to some, but to others she embodied something far more troubling, an elite who could not be reached, a voice of judgment that dismissed the messy realities of life. This is what set the stage for the drama now unfolding. For when arrogance confronts resilience, the clash does not remain in the courtroom. It becomes a story, a parable, a battle that resonates far beyond its walls. And in Barrett's case, the very qualities that her admirers revered, her detachment, her cutting precision, her disdain for anything resembling passion, would soon transform into the seeds of her undoing. Because the danger of intellectual arrogance is that it mistakes silence for surrender. It fails to recognize when composure hides strength, when pause disguises preparation. Barrett, seated high upon her bench, believed she had delivered the final word. She believed the room was hers, and for a fleeting moment it was. But arrogance, as history shows, always plants the seeds of its own undoing. To see Jasmine Crockett sitting silently in that chamber, you had to understand where she came from. Her silence wasn't the silence of someone defeated. It was the silence of someone who had learned all her life that the world was waiting for her to break. From the beginning, Jasmine's story was never one of privilege, never one of easy entry into the rooms of power. She came from the kind of background America likes to overlook until it needs to tell a story of resilience. Working-class roots, long hours, and a relentless climb fueled by the unshakable belief that her voice mattered, even when no one wanted to hear it. As a child, Crockett was told again and again to know her place. Teachers underestimated her, not because of her intellect, but because of her identity. Too outspoken, too sharp, too unwilling to play small. In those moments, she learned the value of composure. Let them doubt, let them mock, she would answer in results. She carried that lesson with her through law school, through the long nights of studying when it seemed like every barrier had been placed in her way to remind her she did not belong. Her rise to Congress was not handed to her. It was fought for brick by brick against the tide of skepticism. In a political system still dominated by old money and old names, she represented a new current, one that carried with it the voices of people who had been told their accents were too thick, their skin too dark, their stories too messy for the polished stage of politics. Crockett turned those very things into her strength. She made identity her banner, not a burden. She walked into the halls of Congress not as someone who tried to fit into the mold, but as someone who reshaped the mold entirely. Her reputation grew quickly, fiery, unafraid, unshaken by the condescension of colleagues who believed that passion had no place in policy. And yet, beneath the fire, there was method. For all her fierce exchanges on the House floor, Crockett was strategic. She knew when to unleash her sharp tongue, and she knew when to wait. When silence could slice deeper than words. That balance of fury and calculation became her weapon, and it was sharpened by every underestimation she endured. Critics tried to paint her as a caricature, a loud voice with little substance. They mocked her style, her confidence, the unapologetic way she carried herself as a black woman in spaces not built for her. But each insult only added to the arsenal she carried within. Every time someone dismissed her, it fueled the next speech, the next debate, the next viral moment where she proved again and again that she could not be silenced. By the time she entered this courtroom clash, Crockett had already lived 1,000 dismissals. And in every single one, she had found a way to turn the insult into ignition. That was her story. Not one of doors freely opening, but of doors slammed shut and broken down anyway. She carried with her the weight of those who had been erased from the record, who never had the chance to sit where she sat. Her very presence was defiance, and that defiance made her dangerous to those who relied on quiet compliance. Crockett wasn't just a politician, she was a reminder. A reminder that power, once attained by those long denied it, does not bend easily back into silence. When Judge Barrett delivered her cutting line, there were many who thought Crockett would falter, that perhaps this was finally the moment the Congresswoman would be diminished. But they hadn't lived her story. They hadn't seen the girl who refused to let condescension kill her dreams. They hadn't seen the law student who argued until her voice was raw because no one else would argue for her. They hadn't seen the young lawyer walking into courtrooms where her clients were dismissed the same way she was, and proving through evidence and reason that justice could not be denied. All of that, the struggle, the fight, the long history of being told no, sat quietly with her in that courtroom. And it transformed her silence into something far greater than submission. Because for Jasmine Crockett, silence was not the absence of strength. It was the accumulation of it. She was ready for this clash, ready for this dismissal, ready for this very moment that Judge Barrett thought she had won. Every battle behind her had been rehearsal for this stage, this courtroom, this test of composure. And so, as the cameras zoomed in and the chamber held its breath, Crockett did what she had always done best. She waited. She calculated. She prepared to strike not with rage, but with precision. And when Barrett's attack landed, Crockett's silence wasn't weakness. It was calculation. The first words after the silence came not from Crockett, but from Barrett. The judge leaned forward again, her glasses sliding slightly down her nose, her voice clipped and deliberate. "Congresswoman, if you cannot keep your remarks tethered to the legal question before us, then perhaps this proceeding is not the place for your commentary. The words dripped with authority, coated in a veneer of civility, but sharpened with the unmistakable sting of condescension. The room tensed. It was not the statement itself, it was the implication. Barrett was not questioning the argument. She was questioning the speaker's right to argue at all. Crockett finally spoke, but not in the fiery tone her critics expected. She was calm, measured, her voice steady enough to make those leaning forward wonder if she had even been rattled in the first place. With respect, Your Honor, every remark I've made speaks to the core of this issue. The law doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in people's lives. The words hung in the air. They were not shouted. They were not barbed. They were deliberate, almost disarming. For a brief moment, Barrett blinked, as if caught off guard by the absence of defensiveness. Then she pressed harder. Lives, Congresswoman, are not arguments. We must deal in precedent, not passion. Her tone sharpened, the cadence colder now, revealing just enough frustration to suggest Crockett's restraint had struck a nerve. Crockett tilted her head slightly, the faintest of smiles tugging at her lips. Precedent without passion, she said softly, is the kind of law that forgets who it serves. A murmur rippled through the audience. It wasn't quite a rebuttal, but it was enough to tilt the balance. Barrett straightened, adjusting her robe as if to reclaim authority. This is not a rally, Congresswoman. This is the highest standard of legal discourse. We cannot afford theatrics. And yet, with every attempt to dismiss her, Barrett seemed to be fueling the very image she hoped to undermine. Crockett did not raise her voice, did not rush. She leaned into the stillness, her responses precise, clipped, each one quietly refusing to concede ground. Observers could feel the tug-of-war in real time. Barrett's dominance came through force of stature, the centuries-old weight of the bench itself. Crockett's strength came through composure, a refusal to let condescension dictate her tempo. Each time Barrett sought to corner her, Crockett sidestepped, not with aggression, but with clarity. The exchanges sharpened. Barrett, you presume to lecture this court on principles you scarcely seem to grasp. Crockett, I'm not lecturing, Your Honor. I'm reminding, because principles mean nothing if the people don't feel them. Barrett, emotion clouds judgment. Crockett, so does arrogance. That final word cut through the chamber. A few gasps broke out, hushed quickly by nervous glances at the judge. Barrett's lips tightened, her jaw tiff. She glanced down at her notes, then back at Crockett, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. The confidence that had seemed immovable minutes earlier now bore the faintest crack. For those watching, the shift was palpable. Barrett was the judge, yes, but Crockett was beginning to command the narrative. The duel no longer felt like one-sided dismissal. It was becoming a contest of wills. And yet, Crockett didn't push too far. She didn't leap into fiery rhetoric or dramatic outbursts. She knew Barrett was expecting that. Instead, she let the tension simmer. She gave the impression that she was holding something back, something greater, leaving both Barrett and the audience unsettled by the possibility of what might come next. The air was taut, strung like a wire ready to snap. Viewers at home could feel it even through their screens. The arrogance of authority was colliding head-on with the composure of defiance, and neither side seemed willing to break. Then came the moment, the pause, the breath, that signaled a storm was about to break. The pause stretched longer than anyone expected. Crockett sat back in her chair, eyes steady, hands folded, as if letting the silence do its own work. For an instant, it seemed almost uncomfortable, a vacuum where words were expected. But then she spoke, and when she did, her voice carried with the clarity of someone who had been waiting her whole life for this moment. Your Honor, she began slowly, deliberately, you say that passion clouds judgment, but history shows us something different. It wasn't cold precedent that ended segregation. It wasn't detached reasoning that pushed this nation to expand its promise of equality. It was people, passionate, ordinary people, demanding to be seen, to be heard, to be treated as fully human. The courtroom shifted. A few heads lifted. Barrett narrowed her eyes but said nothing. Crockett, to continued, her words gaining rhythm. You dismiss my words as theatrics, but what you call theatrics, I call truth-telling. What you call performance, Because, Your Honor, I didn't come here just to recite legal jargon that floats above people's lives. I came here to remind us that every ruling, every decision lands on someone's kitchen table, in someone's paycheck, in someone's child's future. Gasps rippled softly, almost inaudible but unmistakable. Barrett's jaw tensed. She adjusted her papers, though it was clear her focus had slipped. Crockett was commanding the room now. She leaned slightly forward, locking eyes with the judge. And I know why my tone unsettles you. Because when a black woman refuses to bow, when she refuses to dilute her conviction, it disrupts the order you've grown comfortable with. You'd prefer I shrink, that I couch my words in apology, but I won't, because I represent too many who've already been told to sit down and stay quiet. The chamber froze. Issues. A reporter dropped his pen. Cameras zoomed in, hungry to capture the moment. Crockett allowed herself a brief pause, then pressed on. Precedent, Your Honor, is not holy scripture. It is the record of choices made by people just as fallible as we are. And sometimes precedent has been used to justify the very injustices we now condemn. If passion is what forces us to correct those wrongs, then I will never apologize for bringing it into this room. The audience could feel it now, the balance shifting, the air thick with the realization that Barrett's grip was slipping. The judge opened her mouth as if to interject, but Crockett was already moving, her cadence quickening, her presence swelling like a crescendo. Do you call it theatrics when a mother weeps at her child's grave because justice was denied? Do you call it theatrics when an immigrant works 3 jobs and still cannot see their family protected by law? Do you call it theatrics when communities beg for fairness and are met with silence? She shook her head slowly, her eyes never are leaving Barrett's. If so, then let me be theatrical, because I refuse to strip humanity from justice. I refuse to act as though law is divorced from life. The words landed like hammer blows. People in the gallery sat straighter, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. It was as if they were watching history crystallize before their eyes. And then came the line that would replay on television loops, trend on social media, and echo in households across the nation. Crockett's voice dropped low, sharp as steel. Theatrics may entertain, but arrogance destroys, and I'd rather be guilty of reminding this court of the people it serves than guilty of forgetting them. The room erupted, not with cheers, for decorum held them back, but with the unmistakable sound of breathless gasps, stifled exclamations, a murmur swelling like a tide. Even the stenographer's fingers paused for a fraction of a second, stunned by what she had just heard. Barrett shifted in her seat. Her composure, once so untouchable, flickered with visible strain. Her lips tightened, her eyes darted briefly to the crowd before returning to Crockett. For the first time in the exchange, the judge seemed cornered, not by hostility, but by the undeniable force of truth delivered with poise. Crockett wasn't finished. She softened her tone, speaking now not just to Barrett but to everyone in the room, and by extension, everyone watching. This trial isn't about me, and it isn't about you. It's about what America we choose to be. One that dismisses voices it doesn't value, or one that understands that dignity doesn't need permission from the powerful to exist. Silence followed. Heavy, ringing silence. And then, almost on cue, phones lit up in the audience as whispers turned to frantic typing. Hashtags began forming. Clips were already being uploaded. The moment had jumped from the confines of the court brawlers, to the vast stage of the internet, where narrative spreads faster than rulings ever could. Crockett leaned back, letting the energy settle. Her point made, her dominance established, without raising her voice or breaking her composure. She had flipped the script entirely. What had begun as an insult now stood as her triumph. Barrett adjusted her robe again, eyes lowered for the briefest second. A gesture small enough to escape casual viewers, but magnified in meaning for those who had been watching closely. The woman who moments ago had held the room now seemed rattled, her authority challenged in real time, her dismissal exposed as brittle under fire. The chamber sat suspended, aware it had just witnessed the kind of moment that outlives its setting. Theatrics? No, it was something else entirely. It was the dignity of a woman who had been underestimated too many times, rising unflinching before the symbol of authority that had tried to diminish her. And as the weight of Crockett's words echoed in the silence, one truth was undeniable. The atmosphere had flipped. She was no longer on the defensive. She had seized the narrative, claimed the power, and left Barrett visibly shaken. Then, in the hush that followed, the future of the moment revealed itself. Because what began as a courtroom clash was already transforming into a cultural earthquake, the murmurs in that chamber were only the beginning. And the shockwaves didn't stop in that courtroom. They erupted across the entire nation. The clip spread like wildfire. Within hours of Crockett's counterattack, hashtags exploded across social media. Hashtag Crockett clapback trended first, then #passion is power, and finally the phrase that came directly from her closing line, arrogance destroys. TikToks looped her words over dramatic music, Twitter feeds lit up with fiery threads, and Instagram flooded with reels showing her steady gaze cutting through Barrett's icy composure. For once, the viral moment wasn't a gaffe or a stumble. It was a triumph, and millions wanted to be part of it. On late-night television, hosts replayed the exchange, pausing to savor the delivery. One leaned across his desk, grinning at the camera. You ever see someone take down a Supreme Court justice with nothing but pure composure? Crockett just did. And Barrett looked like she wanted to crawl under her own robe. The audience roared. Another host opened their monologue by mimicking Barrett's scowl, then cut to Crockett's steady takedown, ending with a raised fist. The crowd stood on their feet. In barbershops and coffee houses, at college campuses and kitchen tables, the debate spilled into daily conversation. For progressives, Crockett had become an emblem of resistance, a living refutation of the idea that power always rests comfortably with the powerful. She didn't just defend herself, one viral tweet read. She defended all of us who've been told to shut up, calm down, or sit in the back. The post racked up 500,000 likes in 2 days. Meanwhile, Barrett's defenders scrambled. Conservative pundits attempted to frame Crockett's words as disrespectful or overblown, but their clips drew more mockery than support. Memes showed Barrett frowning beneath captions like, "When you bring shade but get eclipsed." Another depicted her gavel, replaced with a mic, dropped at her feet. The irony was too delicious to ignore. The judge who had tried to dismiss Crockett's passion was now remembered only for being on the receiving end of it. More striking, though, was the reaction among communities long sidelined in national politics. In immigrant neighborhoods, Crockett's words about mothers, workers, and children rang out like recognition long overdue. Clips were translated into Spanish, Urdu, and Creole, spreading far beyond English-speaking audiences. Activists abroad picked it up too. Students in London marched with placards reading, "Passion is power," owning her verbatim. For many Black women in particular, the resonance cut deeper. Opinion columns poured in, declaring Crockett's stance not just a victory for herself, but for every woman of color who had ever been dismissed as too emotional or too loud in professional spaces. She stood there with the weight of generations on her shoulders, one columnist wrote, and made it clear that passion isn't weakness, it's the heartbeat of justice. The line went viral on its own, but the shock waves weren't all celebratory. In conservative corners, Crockett's performance was painted as evidence of America's supposed decline into emotional politics. A senator muttered on cable news, "This is what happens when theatrics replace discipline." Yet even as he spoke, the chyron beneath him replayed Crockett's words, and the clips continued to rack up millions of views. His critique was drowned out by the very moment he sought to undermine. Barrett herself remained silent in the immediate aftermath. No statements, no interviews. The optics were damning. Silence looked like retreat, while Crockett's words seemed to echo louder with each passing day. Editorial cartoons portrayed Barrett as towering in her robes but shrinking under Crockett's gaze. One viral illustration showed Crockett holding a torch, illuminating a courtroom where Barrett stood in the shadows. What made the fallout so powerful was not just Crockett's delivery, but the way people claimed it as their own. Teachers played the clip in classrooms to spark debates about justice. Organizers used it as rallying fuel. Musicians sampled her words into protest anthems. In one viral remix, the line, Theatrics may entertain, but arrogance destroys, dropped just before a booming beat, transforming into a chant for rallies across the country. Even mainstream figures couldn't resist. Celebrities posted the clip with captions like, "That's how oddity, you do it," and "Queen energy." Athletes quoted her in post-game interviews. A Grammy-winning singer tweeted, "Crockett reminded us that being unapologetically passionate is a superpower." Each share widened the circle of resonance, turning one courtroom moment into a cultural declaration. Yet beneath the spectacle, something more profound simmered. Crockett's counterattack didn't just embarrass a judge, it unsettled a narrative. For decades, the powerful had framed restraint as virtue and passion as recklessness. But Crockett inverted the script. She proved that clarity and conviction could coexist, that refusing to bow didn't mean losing control. The story wasn't just about her dignity, it was about rewriting the terms of how dignity is defined. And that, more than the hashtags or the memes, explained why the moment stuck. It wasn't just catharsis, it was validation. People across the nation saw themselves reflected in her defiance. Immigrants who'd been silenced, workers dismissed, students overlooked, mothers ignored. Crockett had given them not just a performance but a vocabulary for their own resistance. By the week's end, a commentator summed it up on a Sunday morning show. This wasn't just a clapback, it was a cultural reset. Crockett showed that passion can carry the weight of reason, and reason without passion collapses under arrogance. That's why this moment will linger. In the days that followed, as the noise of hashtags and headlines slowly quieted, Representative Jasmine Crockett's own words rose above the clamor. She didn't linger on the pettiness of the attack. She didn't gloat over the memes or the applause. Instead, she reframed the moment into something larger. Something meant not just for herself, but for every person who had ever felt the sting of dismissal. But the real impact wasn't just the memes. It was the lesson Crockett distilled from the chaos. So when history replays this clash, it won't be remembered as Judge Barrett's cutting remark. It will be remembered as the day Jasmine Crockett flipped the script, transforming a moment of dismissal into a lasting victory of dignity over arrogance. That courtroom became more than a stage for legal sparring. It became a mirror for the nation, reflecting what we choose to value: the cold sharpness of elitism or the unshakable strength of resilience. Crockett's triumph wasn't just hers alone. It belonged to every immigrant who has been told to wait their turn, every young leader who has been underestimated, every voice that has been silenced in the halls of power. In that instant, she didn't just defend herself, she defended the belief that truth and dignity still matter in American democracy. And now, the question comes to us. What do we do with this moment? Do we let it fade into another headline? Another clip lost in the endless scroll? Or do we carry it forward, reminding ourselves that the story isn't finished? Because every time dignity is defended, every time arrogance is challenged, democracy takes one more step toward the promise it was meant to keep. If you believe in that promise, if you believe in dignity over arrogance, in voices rising instead of being silenced, then this is your call to action. Subscribe to this channel, share this story, and keep the fire alive. Together, we can make sure moments like this don't just inspire for a day, but fuel a movement for years to come. Because Crockett's stand wasn't just a courtroom victory, it was an invitation. And now, it's our turn to answer.